Another great video by Andy later. There is again something that I would like to add to what he said. Not because there was anything wrong with what he said, but just because there is another angle that you can look at and arrive at a very similar conclusion. In his last video, Andy points out that in the nature of many of the conflicts that are raging on this planet at the moment, there is always a lot of finger pointing going on and a lot of looking at the past as a means of explaining why the conflict exists that exists today. And as Andy very well points out, you can in that regard always go back further and further and further and find more and more possible causes for the conflict. But that of course raises another very obvious observation with regard to these conflicts. Even if you could legitimately point the finger of blame at something or somebody in the past and use that as an explanation for why the conflict exists today, how is that going to resolve issues? And to only name a very pertinent example, you only need to look at the situation that Israel finds itself in today in the Middle East. Now, we can all look at the history of the State of Israel that was created in 1948, and we can point out, if we are so inclined, that an awful lot of injustice was heaped upon the people in Palestine, as it was called at the time, and how so many people, how so many Palestinians lost their homes, lost their land, and so on and so forth, and how unjust all of that was. However, we are now looking at a state of Israel 60 years later, more than 60 years later, and now you need to consider the following simple fact. Every Israeli who is less than 70 years old, I would even say less than 80 years old, would not have been in any position to exert any influence on any of the decisions made prior to or in 1948. So they cannot consider themselves guilty of anything. And of course, anybody who was actually born after 1948 cannot be in any way linked to what happened back then. These people were all born in the State of Israel, they grew up in the State of Israel, and they are Israelis. So think about, if you're looking at a solution that involves the Palestinians getting back what is owed to them, how are you envisaging that happening? And what should happen to those Israelis? After all, Israel is their home. There basically is no solution to this conflict that involves anybody getting any form of justice. No matter how you dice it, somebody is going to get the wrong end of the stick. Somebody is going to fall by the wayside. So the only thing that is left in that situation to do is to resolve the conflict. Blame can or cannot be attributed, but no matter how you attribute it, it cannot change what has happened in the past. And therefore the only valid approach to a conflict like that one is to look forward and look for resolutions, look for reconciliation. No matter how painful that might be, it is literally the only way out of the conflict. The other alternative, of course, is to remain mired in conflict and to perpetuate it, so that 3 generations down the line, people can point at what happened today and blame some of us.